Biggest stories that matter to you the most. Breaking news, John Calipari is finalizing a 5-year deal to become the Arkansas Razorbacks' next head coach, covering college sports like no one else. The biggest guests in sports. We now welcome in Hall of Famer Jim Calhoun.
Such a pride I had, I came to connect.
The legend, Tim Tebow, joins us.
We'll run it back. I like it.
The legend, Herschel Walker. Welcome in, everybody. Monday night edition, Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Torres. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody had a great July 4th week. I know a lot of people took time off last week. I know a lot of people are taking time off this week, but hope everybody had a great holiday. And I'll tell you what, we are back for the first time in a week as well. We actually haven't done a live show since the second day of the NBA draft when Bronny got selected by the Lakers. We were planning to do a show last week, had some technical difficulties, so we ran a few of those college hoops offseason grades posts on the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube feed. But today, we are back with a full show, and a show that I'm actually really excited about. So we are officially, listen, love college hoops. We have covered college hoops as well as anybody, I believe, anywhere over the course of the offseason. But it's time to start looking ahead to mostly football. And today feels like a good day because we are a week removed from Texas and Oklahoma officially joining the SEC, and we are a week away from SEC Media Days. It sounds crazy. So what we're going to do is talk SEC Media Days. I'm going to give you my big stories, the things that I think matter, as we are now a week away from SEC Media Days, as crazy as it sounds. We'll discuss the big storylines, all of that. From there, we will hit on one other college football story that I saw this weekend. Did you see the report? Oregon got a commitment from the number one wide receiver in America. Other schools are crying foul. They're saying that Oregon has unlimited NIL money. There is a report out that they essentially have a no cap on their NIL. People are mad. I'm going to tell you, does it even matter at all? Because ultimately Dan Lanning is rolling at a really high level. We will talk a little bit of basketball to end the show. Dan Hurley gets his long-awaited contract extension. You know I have thoughts on that and what it means for both UConn and college basketball as a whole. And oh, by the way, Team USA, I actually do want to talk a little Team USA. I'm actually excited to watch the Olympics over the next couple weeks, so we will talk about that. Busy show, busy Monday show. It is the post-holiday edition of the Aaron Torres Pod. Again, hope everybody had a great 4th of July week. And also hope you're ready to kind of gear up here as we get ready for football. It's going to be a fun couple weeks as we get ready for football. So make sure that you are subscribed to the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube channel and subscribed Apple, Spotify, etc. With that said, it's Monday. It's early July. Everybody else is taking time off, but not your boy Torres. And so there is no more time to waste. Let's go ahead and get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, like I just told you, college football is right around the corner. And listen, we are still going to talk basketball as stuff comes up. We obviously, as I said, we'll talk Dan Hurley later on in the show. And, listen, there's going to be recruiting stuff that comes up. We've done a bunch of recruiting clips over the last couple days. And I have no doubt in my mind that there's going to be some interesting things from the basketball world. At the same time, though, we are officially full speed ahead with college football. And with a week out to SEC Media Days, today feels like a good day to just do the hard pivot, okay? And a lot of you haven't heard me talk much football, if any football at all. But like I said, today feels like a great day. By the way, you could drop your college football, your college hoops questions in the chat. We will get to them later in the show. Let's jump into our SEC Media Days talk, though, because, again, 7 days from now, all 16 schools will convene in Dallas, Texas. By the way, hope by next year, producer Matt and I will be able to go. There was some scheduling conflicts this year. I'm not going to be able to attend, but we're getting close. And I just want to do what I deem to be the 5 biggest storylines in the SEC coming into this season, because we are 7 days away from SEC Media Days. In my opinion, this segment's just a little bit of a refresher. Everything you've forgotten over the summer, because incredibly, we are 6 weeks away from week 0, 7 weeks away from that Labor Day weekend. And so college football is coming fast. It's exciting. Let's get into my 5 biggest storylines in college football this year, specifically in the SEC. Number 1, let me start by saying this. It's a crazy offseason in college football. When Alabama is replacing Nick Saban, the greatest to ever do it, in my opinion, and that's not even the number 1 storyline in the SEC going into the season. That is because, as I said a week ago, Texas and Oklahoma, as the clock struck midnight on June 30th, there were celebrations. Pitbull performed in Austin, Texas, and I bring it up because as June 30th turned to July 1st, Texas and Oklahoma are officially members of the SEC. And I'll be honest, listen, I'm not going to do the thing. I think it's become kind of a discourse on social media over the last couple weeks. SEC fans trying to take digs and shots at Texas and Oklahoma. Listen, I think both have a chance to be really good over the course of their time in the SEC. It is going to be a step up in competition, but those are 2 great programs that have historically had a ton of success. And I actually think both have the chance to be really good this year. Let's go ahead and start with Texas, because I think we all believe that Texas is the team that realistically probably is the one that is better suited right now entering the SEC to have immediate success. They are, of course, coming off a Big 12 title, a college football playoff appearance, Steve Sarkisian entering his 4th year. And so let's start right there. Credit to Sark. If you listen to this show, it was a year ago that I was the guy that was like, Sark's never won more than 8, 9 games as a college football head coach in a season. Quinn Ewers coming into last season was not established, 56% completion percentage his first year as a starter. And I kind of just sat there and said, are we sure that Texas is that good? Are we sure they're really ready for the Big 12 last year, but certainly the SEC this year? Well, a year passes, they win the Big 12, and I think they have a chance to do really well really early this season. First off, it's worth noting, really good roster coming back. They did make the college football playoff, but Quinn Ewers is back. The offensive line is as good, frankly, as any in college football coming into the year. And I think while the defense has questions, and there are questions on the offense as well, they lost the entire receiving core. A.D. Mitchell's now with the Indianapolis Colts. Xavier Worthy is now with the Kansas City Chiefs. At the same time, they did well in the portal. They have recruited well, top 5 recruiting class last year. And I believe they are very well built for the SEC. More important than that, listen, as we go forward in this SEC Big Ten world, I am convinced that we are going to start talking about schedules in college football the way we do in the NFL. I was saying this on Fox Sports Radio over the last couple weeks. You know how every year in the NFL, you have a team that goes from worst to first? Last year was the Houston Texans. It was whatever. Well, in the NFL, you have teams that, yes, they improve through the draft or through free agency or hire a new head coach. But part of the reason we see every single year teams go from last to first is because in the NFL, last place teams play last place schedules. And so I bring it up because from Texas's perspective, they got about as manageable of a schedule as you possibly could coming into the SEC this year. Now, it won't be easy. They do play Michigan in the out of conference, and they do play Georgia at home. So I know you're probably sitting there saying, how is it possible that we're talking about Texas as having an easy schedule? First off, they only have 3 SEC road games this year. They play Oklahoma in Dallas. That counts as a road game. So now they only have 3 road games this season. The road games are at Vandy, at Arkansas, at Texas A&M. Now, I know that Arkansas is a very tough place to play. The last time that Texas played there, they got run out of the building. I think it was Sark's first or second year, whatever it was. First year, I think it was. But at the same time, by SEC schedules, at Arkansas, at Vandy, at A&M is about as easy as you can possibly get. Also worth noting, at home they get Georgia, toughest game on the schedule by a mile, at least in SEC play. And in this new era of the SEC, it's also who do you avoid in any given season? Well, this year, they don't play Alabama. They don't play Ole Miss, which is really good. They don't play Tennessee, which is really good. They don't play LSU, which is really good. They don't play Missouri, which is really good. I mean, those are right there. Like 5 or 6 top 10, top 15 teams. Texas avoids all of them. So on the one hand, you have Texas, experienced, well coached. Now I will say, we'll see if the week-to-week grind in the SEC, if they get tripped up here or there. And we'll see Quinn Ewers has to stay healthy. 2 years in a row, he's suffered an injury, hasn't had to miss extended time, but hopefully there's not an issue there. Oklahoma to me is kind of the opposite. Feels like they're kind of coming in under the radar. I will give Oklahoma fans credit because in my opinion, I think they're coming in with an understanding that it's a process. Brent Venables is only in year 3, and it's easy to forget. You know, Oklahoma actually won 10 games last year. Oklahoma went 10-3 a year ago. They actually beat Texas. Everybody forgets that part. Red River Shootout, Dylan Gabriel, they beat Texas. But with Oklahoma, there are a couple things working against them. One, they are actually a very young team. Dylan Gabriel transfers. It's because they wanted to get Jackson Arnold, the 5-star freshman a year ago, into that starting spot. Well, he's coming in. Oklahoma has to replace its entire offensive line. The defense improved last year, but improved is, of course, a relative term because they statistically had one of the worst defenses in college football 2 years ago. So I think Venables figures it out. Coming off a 10-win year, but first-year quarterback, entirely new offensive line. Let me just ask you a question. Have you seen the Oklahoma schedule for next year? It is insane. Listen, everybody talks about Florida having the toughest schedule in the country, and they might. They play Miami, UCF, and Florida State out of conference. Oklahoma's schedule is absolutely insane, though, okay? This is just, let me just read you the last 5 games of Oklahoma's season. At Ole Miss, Maine. Okay, Maine's not very good. Not part of the Southeastern Conference. At Ole Miss, Maine. At Missouri, Bama. At LSU. So the last 3 weeks, at Missouri, Bama, at LSU. Also Ole Miss. And then how about this 3-game stretch in the middle of the season? SEC opener at home against Tennessee. That's obviously a huge game. Josh Heupel returning to Norman. Josh Heupel led them to a national championship. Then, after that emotional game, but before your rivalry game with Texas, you got to go to Auburn, which is a really tough place to play. So Oklahoma, in my opinion, could be a very good team, but that schedule is just insane. We'll do some over-under stuff as the season goes on. But as you can see on the ticker, producer Matt has brought up all of the over-under win totals in alphabetical order. Oklahoma's win total is 7.5 wins, and it's because of that insane schedule. That was a long number 1, so let's get to number 2 in terms of what I believe to be the most interesting storylines in the SEC. We are a week away from SEC Media Days. That's what I just said earlier. It is for the first time since 2006. Alabama's got itself a new football coach, okay? And we all know where we were and what we were doing when Nick Saban announced he was going to retire. And there was certainly a few days of trepidation for Alabama fans. But I'll also say, I think in reality, Alabama did about as well as they could by hiring Kalen DeBoer. So Kalen DeBoer comes in. And in my opinion, I think there's kind of a big picture and a small picture way of looking at things. And I want to talk about both, but let's start with the big picture. Big picture is, what did I just say? I think they did about as well as they could. Remember, the day that Nick Saban retired, who were the guys that most people linked to the job? Steve Sarkisian, Dan Lanning. Why is that important? Well, Kalen DeBoer, 5-0 against those two guys combined. Beat Sark twice in the postseason, including last year's college football playoff, and beat Dan Lanning 3 times head-to-head. So you have a great X's and O's coach, a great game day coach, a great coach in big games. And now, as we've discussed on this show, DeBoer is proving that he can recruit at this SEC level. Everybody said, oh, this guy, will he be able to recruit in the SEC? Well, so far, so good, because as we've talked about a few times, and we've certainly talked about it on the YouTube channel, Alabama right now has the number 2 recruiting class in the country. Only Ohio State is ranked ahead of them, and Ohio State they've taken 3 more players, so the average player ranking at Alabama is actually higher and right around second or third best in all of college football. So Kalen DeBoer has proven that he can recruit, has proven that he can recruit at the highest level, at least so far, and we'll see if this all holds up before signing day. And he's won big games. That's the big picture. The small picture, which I think is also worth noting, this year, like Oklahoma, is going to be really tough for Alabama, okay? Have you seen Alabama's schedule? Again, these SEC schedules now with Texas and Oklahoma and the elimination of divisions are just bananas. Here is Alabama's schedule, okay? They play at Wisconsin in the out of conference. In conference, here are some of their notable games. At Tennessee, third weekend of October, third Saturday of October. At LSU, it's that year where they play both of them on the road. Oh, and then a week before the Iron Bowl at Oklahoma. So just in the out of conference, at Wisconsin, at Tennessee, at LSU, at Oklahoma, or excuse me, just on the road, excuse me, not out of conference, just on the road. At Wisconsin, at LSU, at Tennessee, at Oklahoma. Those are 4 of the toughest venues in college football to play in. Then at home, you got the likes of Auburn in an always contentious Iron Bowl. You got Missouri, which is probably going to be a top 10 team coming into this year. It's really tough. Good news for Kalen DeBoer. Like I said with Oklahoma, it feels to me like Alabama fans kind of understand, hey, this is a process. This is a rebuild. It's going to take time. I know there are 15 other fan bases that are adamant. Alabama stinks. The dynasty's dead, blah, 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 blah. And if Kalen DeBoer goes 9-3, they're going to be demanding he be fired. Based on the reactions around Alabama, I have not seen that. I think he's got a little bit of a grace period. Kalen DeBoer, the new head coach at Alabama, coming in at number 2. Number 3, most interesting SEC storylines. I got to be honest. This Georgia revenge tour is about to be scary. Okay, so let me say this. I'm the guy, and I'm not, this is sort of a humble brag, but I'm also going to set up what I'm going to say in a minute. A year ago on this show, my preseason national championship pick was Michigan to win the national championship. My preseason pick to win the SEC was Alabama. Both of those things ended up coming true. So it'd be easy for me to just take the victory lap. I'm awesome. I'm incredible, whatever. But I bring it up because while Michigan won the title, while Alabama won the SEC, there was a legitimate argument that Georgia was the best team in the country. Essentially destroyed everybody in the regular season, went 12-0, lost to Alabama. Listen, can't discredit them, but Alabama was the deserved SEC champ. I was happy because I picked Alabama to win that game. I picked Alabama in the preseason. But you look at Georgia, and that was a team that I think was good enough to compete with anybody. They beat Florida State by 60 in the Orange Bowl. And here's the crazy part. They return a lot off that team. And that team, in my opinion, was maybe the most balanced team, probably outside of Michigan, in college football last year. Okay? Think about this. Who are the teams that we always deem to be the best offenses in college football and in this new age SEC? Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin's always good. Sark and Texas are coming in with a great offense. Tennessee, Josh Heupel, right? Those kind of offenses. You know, Georgia actually had a better offense than this Texas offense that everybody loves, than Ole Miss, than Missouri, than Tennessee, than all these great offenses. Georgia actually had a better offense than all of them last year. Number 2 offense in the SEC. The only one that was better was LSU with the Heisman Trophy winner, Jaden Daniels. At the same time, remember last year, Alabama wins the SEC. It's because of that defense that just wore you down, wore down Tennessee in the second half, wore down LSU in the second half, wore down Georgia in the second half. Statistically, Georgia's defense was better than Alabama's. So they had an offense that was better than Texas's and a defense that was better than Alabama's. You can make the case that they were the best team in college football last year. Michigan, deserved national champion, doesn't change that fact. Bring it up to very simply say that looking ahead to 2024, I think they're coming on a warpath, okay? Carson Beck is back. Carson Beck, by the way, I don't know how many people know this, 3rd most passing yards in college football last year behind only Michael Penix and Bo Nix. Receiving room is elite. Defense will be incredible. Offensive line will be incredible. Trevor Etienne transfers in as a running back from Florida, and they should be really, really, really good. Only thing about Georgia, Schedule does get a little bit tougher without divisions. No Vandy, no South Carolina. And the schedule is pretty brutal. At Alabama, at Ole Miss, at Texas. That is an insane schedule. At Alabama, at Ole Miss, at Texas. Tennessee at home. Who else is at home? You got Tennessee at home. You got Florida on a neutral. You got Clemson on a neutral. Good news is they're Georgia, and they're going to find a way to win most of those games. But this could be one of the weird things, and we'll get to it at number 5. But it could be one of those weird things where Georgia, just because of the nature of the schedule, takes a loss or 2, but then goes to the SEC championship game and destroys somebody, or gets into the college football playoff as the 7 seed and destroys somebody. Georgia's the probably going to be the preseason favorite in the SEC. And I don't want to put any spoiler alerts, but I think they probably should be number 1 going into the year. Number 4, SEC storylines to watch. I think to me, it's who's number 4. Most people would agree Georgia and Texas are probably the 2 best teams in the SEC. And I think people would probably give Alabama the benefit of the doubt. But even if you don't give Alabama the benefit of the doubt, what I think is in this 12-team playoff era where there's going to be 5 auto bids and, of course, 7 at-larges, I think you're getting 3 at-larges minimum from the SEC, which means you're probably getting 4 teams from the SEC. So the question becomes, who is that 4th team? Because they're going to get a shot to play for a championship. The teams that I think everybody's excited about going into this year, feels like Ole Miss and Missouri have a lot of buzz this time of year. And frankly, very similar storylines from a year ago. Both finished 11-2. Both kicked the crap out of a Big Ten team in a big bowl game. Ole Miss destroyed Penn State in the Peach Bowl. Missouri, remember, they destroyed Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl. That was the sound the alarm situation in Columbus that led to Ryan Day, spending like a sailor coming to port in the NIL and the portal this year because he needed to squad up with his team. So both those teams finish 11-2, both beat a Big Ten team, and both bring back a lot this year. Missouri, obviously, Brady Cook, the starting quarterback, who was really good last year. And then on top of that, Luther Burden, probably the best wide receiver in college football. Defense was good. They do lose their defensive coordinator to LSU, so that's kind of worth noting. And then Ole Miss. Ole Miss is certainly an interesting team as well. Jackson Dart is back. Most of the wide receiving core is back. And obviously Lane Kiffin squatted up in the portal. Number 1 transfer portal class according to 24/7 Sports. Walter Nolan, defensive tackle from Texas A&M. The defensive end from Florida. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, who led the Gators in tackles for loss and sacks last year. Ole Miss is going to be really good. Missouri is going to be really good. And I am curious, does somebody else step up in that 4th spot? Is it LSU, which certainly has a lot of questions? Is it maybe Tennessee with Nico Imamalieva at quarterback now? Or is it somebody else? But I think that 4 spot is going to be the spot to follow because I think we're getting 4 teams in this 12-team college football playoff. Finally, number 5, it really is just a summary of essentially everything that we've talked about because I just think number 5, and this is maybe more of a big picture college football thing than it is an SEC media days thing or an SEC thing. College football is just going to be so different this year. And I am so curious how everybody handles everything, but just how different even in the SEC things are going to be. Like I said, I think it's easy to forget. Everybody talks about the fact that there are Texas and Oklahoma are in the SEC. But here's the crazy thing. It's not just Texas and Oklahoma are in the SEC. It's that we have now eliminated divisions. And so all of a sudden, there are so many teams that either had the benefit of the doubt in the SEC East or just got squished in the SEC West with an insane schedule. And it is going to be a little bit more of a balancing act. Look at somebody like even Georgia. Georgia, all of a sudden, they don't have 2 surefire wins against Vandy and South Carolina on the schedule. Now, I know South Carolina's tough. They've lost even in the Kirby Smart year at South Carolina. South Carolina is not very good on paper this year. Kentucky, kind of the opposite. They still get Florida and Georgia and Tennessee, but on the flip side, they now have to go to Texas. They now have to, play a couple other tough SEC games that wouldn't normally be on the schedule. You look at their schedule. They have Auburn on the schedule. They have at Ole Miss on the schedule. Those are games that they wouldn't have drawn. They don't have Mississippi State this year, which has been their historic cross-division rival, and a game that they have had a lot of success in. So I just bring it up because everybody's schedule looks different. By the way, there's the opposite as well. We talked about Ole Miss a minute ago. Ole Miss, by SEC standards, has a pretty manageable schedule. No Alabama on the schedule this year. No Auburn on the schedule this year. Now they do have Georgia. They do have they do have a couple other intriguing games, but by the standard that they've had, it is more manageable than it's been in the past. They get Oklahoma, but it's at home. So I just bring it up. By the way, Texas A&M is maybe the best example yet. No Alabama, no Georgia on the schedule this year. So I just bring it up because, to me, I'm so curious how this looks, how schedules play a role, but then how do we judge teams, right? Because we all love college football. You wouldn't be watching this show or listening to this show if you didn't. And what becomes fascinating is we know what was deemed a failure of a season even a year ago. Think about LSU. LSU lost to Florida State on opening night, that first Sunday Memorial Day weekend. Then they lost to Ole Miss, like second or third SEC game of the year, and their season was essentially over. Now their season's not over. Now there's still plenty to play for. Now you can have a third, maybe a fourth loss, depending on how things go. So I just bring it up because I think we're entering a whole new world in college football. I'm not sure how many people fully understand. All right, this is what we're going to do. We are going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. When we come back, so one more college football story that I want to discuss. Does Oregon have unlimited NIL? Because other fan bases, something happened over the holiday weekend, and some fan bases are starting to ask some questions. I don't really care, but it's certainly interesting. And then from there, we'll talk a little college hoops. Dan Hurley gets his extension. And there is one, I guess you would say, football story or basketball story beyond Dan Hurley that I am very interested in. We're going to take a quick break, talk more college football. Be right back. Before we do, many of you ask me all the time, Torres, what can I do to help support the show? You give me hours and hours and hours of content every single week. What can I do to help you? Well, I'll tell you what, do me a quick favor. Check out the Aaron Torres Media merchandise store for all of your team-specific shirts, hats, and more, all available at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. A lot of you wondering, Torres, what can I get in that merch store? Well, first of all, we got our brand new Hope and Pope Kentucky basketball t-shirts. That's right. Mark Pope has arrived. He is here to save the day. Get your Hope and Pope t-shirts there. Also, Arkansas fans, the Big Pig Invasion is here. You can get your tees there. Basketball School Alabama shirts. More Hurley 2024 UConn shirts for your tailgates at Rentschler Field, your games at the XL Center or Gamble. And oh, by the way, your Mike effing Woodson gear for Indiana. If you love football, we got you covered too. We got more Dion shirts and hats than we even know what to do with. The freeze warning has hit the plains. Auburn fans, grab your freeze warning tees now. And of course, our new era, new rules shirt applies to Nebraska football and its incredible fan base. We have more coming for the fall, plenty in stock right now. So make sure to check out the Aaron Torres Media merch store at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. And you can always hit me up with any questions. Aaron Torres Podcast Questions @gmail.com. All right, everybody. I'm back. Good to be back. So, do want to get into one other college football story before we get over to some hoops. Dan Hurley gets his extension. And as you can see on the screen, our buddy Puddles has made an appearance. Puddles, of course, is the Oregon Duck mascot. I was going to say logo, but he's a mascot. He's not a logo. We also have the Oregon logo on the screen. Thank you, producer Matt. And again, for everybody just joining us, hope everybody had a great holiday weekend. And thank you for the support. It's a quiet time, but we're going to keep on pumping out the content. With that said, let's get back to football. And I'll say this about July 4th weekend. It turned into a weirdly very busy recruiting week. I don't want to say weirdly because we had a group of June visits. A lot of kids took a lot of visits in June. And so it wasn't weird, but there were a slew of commitments that happened over July 4th weekend. LSU got a pair of defensive linemen that they desperately need. Brian Kelly has not recruited that position group very well. I saw Notre Dame got a kid, a 4-star defensive back. But the big name that committed over the course of the weekend, by the way, I think producer Matt's Auburn Tigers picked up a commitment or two. But at the same time, the story that stood out was DeCorian Moore, the number one wide receiver in the country, had previously committed and decommitted from LSU. He did, in fact, make a college announcement. This was on the night of July 4th. His final four was Oregon, Texas, LSU, and Ohio State. And he commits to the Oregon Ducks. And so Oregon gets commitment. First of all, let me say this. Seems like a sweet kid, had his mom on the podium with him. It was a cool commitment ceremony. This thing went on forever. Like this was the longest commitment ceremony ever. It was on Instagram Live. I was watching the dog. I decided to tune on in just to see what ends up happening. And sure enough, this kid is on Instagram for about 40 minutes before he ends up committing. But Oregon gets the number one wide receiver in DeCorian Moore. If that was the story, though, probably wouldn't be talking about it because Oregon gets big-time recruits all the time. But coming out of the commitment, there was quite a bit of brushback from specifically the schools that did not get DeCorian Moore that maybe, just maybe, even in this world of NIL, even in this world where all these schools are spending all this money, maybe Oregon's playing on a completely different level than anybody else. As a matter of fact, producer Matt, why don't you pop up the tweet that I sent you earlier in the day? Because we have this from a guy who covers Ohio State. He does a great job. But he tweeted this out from SiriusXM. He said, Rick Neuheisel on ESPN College Football XM said he was at a recent coaches event, and it's no secret Phil Knight is supplying Oregon with unlimited NIL resources. Rick said Phil is 86. He desperately wants to see a championship, so they're willing to pay whatever it takes to get players. So I saw that. Also, as of about 6 Eastern time on Monday, if you Googled Oregon NIL, the first thing that pops up on YouTube, because YouTube, of course, is linked to Google, is a YouTube link from a Texas YouTube page that says Oregon is making NIL life hard for Texas. So, first off, I find it absolutely hysterical that we have Ohio State. As I said a minute ago, Ryan Day was spending NIL money like he had 2 months to live and he got to put together the best football team he could. Texas, we know that NIL is not an issue for them. So when you have Ohio State and you have Texas complaining, I find that absolutely hysterical. But let's get into this idea of, does Oregon ultimately have NIL money, unlimited NIL money? And let's take it a step further. Does it really matter, and how much of an impact does it have? Because to me, when I look at this story, what I'll say is that it reminds me of something that we have talked about, a term that I've used a lot on this show. As I say often on this show, two things in life can be true. But even if they seem different, they can both be true at the same time. And so while I think that Oregon has pretty unlimited NIL, I'm also not sure that, one, they're the only one that pretty much has any money that they need. And two, let's take it a step further. I don't think it's the reason why they're getting all these kids. I think it's a great school that has a great history of success during these kids' lives. They recruited well in the pre-NIL era. Dan Lanning's a dog. And I think this has some, but certainly not all, to do with NIL. And so let's start with the obvious. First of all, Phil Knight, this story about Phil Knight, not really surprising because we know that Phil Knight has been funding Oregon athletics for decades now. It's really, you can kind of correlate the rise of Oregon sports with Phil Knight being a major donor. Last time I checked, he's worth $33 billion, so money isn't an issue. But the only difference between this era and 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago is that money now goes towards NIL. 30 years ago, it was towards the head coach and the assistant coaches and facilities. And obviously in Oregon's case, uniforms and gear. So this money has always been there. It's going towards NIL. And I do believe that Oregon's in the upper tier. I don't believe that they have significantly more money to spend than Texas or Ohio State or Texas A&M or some of these other schools that we know are really well funded. I also think it's worth noting a couple other things. Oregon has been recruiting at an elite level since long before the NIL era. I just went back the last 5 or 6 years. Just to see, make sure I'm not tripping over, okay? So 2019, Oregon has the number 7 class in all of college football. 2021, the number 6 class in the country. 2022, now this is interesting because this was the year that Dan Lanning took over as the head coach, had the number 13 class in a transition year where they signed fewer players than everybody else. 2023, they have the number 9 class, and 2024, a year ago, they had the number 3 class in the country behind only Georgia and Alabama. So this idea that this is somehow new and only NIL related, I don't buy it. I think it's also worth noting this. You have to remember that kids that are currently in high school, they have only grown up knowing Oregon as an awesome program, okay? Think about so Chip Kelly led Oregon to a national championship game in the 2011 season. Producer Matt is smiling because, of course, they lost to the Auburn Tigers. Michael Dyer's knee may have been down, but that's neither here nor there. But I bring it up because 2011, to you, to me, doesn't seem that long ago. Well, it was 13 years ago. An 18-year-old kid who is a senior in high school right now, 5 years old at that point. So from 2011 on, Oregon, from Chip Kelly, Mark Helfrich, remember, he was only there, 3 years, but they played for a national championship in one of those years, lost to Ohio State. Mario Cristobal won the Pac-12 in 2019 and 2021 and 2022, had a team good enough to make the college football playoff in all 3 of those years. I just bring it up to say that from Kelly to Helfrich to Cristobal to now Dan Lanning, they've always been good, and that's all that high school players know. So the way that me, as a dude in my 30s, the way that I grew up, Nebraska was always awesome. Miami was always awesome. The Florida Gators were always awesome. Well, for kids in this generation, it's Alabama, it's Clemson, it's Oregon, it's Ohio State, it's a few others, but Oregon is in that conversation. And so you have a school that's always recruited well, a school that, yes, has NIL, but also a school where every high school kid only knows them being awesome. And can we take half a second and maybe give Dan Lanning half a bit of credit here? Because you can have all the NIL money in the world, but if you don't know how to use it and you don't know how to get players to come in and then develop them once they get there, kids aren't going to keep coming. And so what kids now see at Oregon is, yes, there's probably really good NIL, but the team keeps winning. Dan Lanning is a third-year head coach. Went 10-3 in year 1, 11-2 a year ago, was 12-2, I think, actually, was easily good enough to make the college football playoff. Remember, it's easy to forget now. They were a double-digit favorite against Washington in the Pac-12 championship game, okay? That's how good they were. He's developing NFL guys. Bo Nix went from, hate to say it, producer Matt, but essentially unplayable under Brian Harsin and Gus Malzahn to a Heisman finalist and first-round pick under Dan Lanning. And so Oregon has everything right now needed to compete at the highest level. And I only think it's going to get better. And I do believe, I'll say this, and I've said this on the show, every time I credit Dan Lanning, everybody's like, well, what has he really done as a head coach at Oregon? It's like, well, listen, I know he hasn't won a national championship yet. He's also 37 years old, and he's only been a head coach for 2 years. And in those 2 years, he's 22-5, okay? 22-5, including in a year that was the toughest Pac-12 ever. Now, I know it's going to get tougher going into the Big Ten, but I think in some ways the Big Ten isn't totally ready for what Oregon's going to bring as well. Because I don't think you can say Oregon should be favored over Ohio State in the Big Ten. Even the Vegas odds, we talked about them a few weeks ago, Ohio State's a 1-point favorite at Oregon. But Oregon is a favorite against Michigan. Oregon will be favored in every other game they play except for Ohio State this year. And so you look at Dan Lanning. You look at what he's done. Yes, I believe NIL is a factor. I also believe Dan Lanning's a rising star. I believe that he took that Southeastern Conference recruiting infrastructure from Kirby Smart, from Nick Saban, and he brought it to the West Coast. I've told this story before, but my buddy Justin Hopkins covers Oregon for scoopduck.com, part of On3. We had him on my radio show about a year ago after the Big Ten move. He said, man, I was here for the Mario Cristobal years, but I ain't seen nothing like what Dan Lanning does. Dan Lanning has a plan for high school sophomores, for high school freshmen, for transfers, for junior college, for portal, for graduate transfers, for guys with 1 year in the portal, for guys with 3 years in the portal. He said, I've never seen anything like it. I think we're starting to see dividends. I think Oregon is a team that is good enough to win the national championship this year. Yes, I think I think NIL plays a role, but no different than it does at Texas, at Ohio State, at all these other schools that everybody loves. Congrats, Oregon fans. You again have a team that's good enough to win a title. And at least for right now, you have DeCorian Moore committed. Also worth noting, saw that there's a crystal ball out for the number one linebacker in the country, Jonah Williams, a kid out of Texas. Now, he's a little bit of an interesting story because he's a baseball player as well. And I think that Schloss mix-up, Texas A&M, Texas, may have pushed him away from those two Texas schools. DJ Pickett, an elite cornerback. A lot of people think he's going to go to Oregon as well. But at the end of the day, I'm just going to say it. I don't believe that NIL is the only reason that Oregon is recruiting well. And oh, by the way, if you think that NIL is the only factor, I can't really help you. Don't know what else there is to say. All right, really quickly, let's wrap on a couple basketball notes. And I do think there's really only one basketball story coming out of July 4th weekend that's really worth discussing. It was a quiet week. College hoops, the news, outside of some recruiting stuff, we'll still obviously cover recruiting as best as we can. But outside of recruiting, I think we're really hitting a little bit of a slow patch on the college hoops calendar. We'll still do stuff as news breaks, but we're not going to force it anymore. It's officially football season. But at the same time, there was one very interesting piece of basketball news that broke on Monday morning, right out of the holiday weekend. And it is that Dan Hurley, the guy, we have been waiting on that contract extension for well over, 3 months. First of all, I was told at the Final Four that we were on the goal line with Dan Hurley's contract extension, okay? Well, Dan Hurley's contract extension, it does become official. And on Monday, UConn officially announces Dan Hurley has signed a 6-year, $50 million extension. It makes him, I believe, the second highest paid coach in college basketball behind Bill Self. The annual average is about $2.5–3 million short of what the Lakers offered, but it's $20 million less. He takes the job. He is officially staying at UConn long term. And also think it's worth noting, by the way, that his 3 assistant coaches, Kamani Young, Tom Moore, and Luke Murray, all signed extensions as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. And I think when I look at this, there's a lot to discuss, but I think it starts with Dan Hurley. I mean, credit to UConn for getting this done. Credit to Dave Benedict, the AD, for getting this done, because it was just something that had been hanging over. And until it becomes official, you got to worry a little bit if you're a UConn fan. Well, now you really don't have to worry because Dan Hurley is essentially in it for the long haul. Now, I know there's NBA stuff, which we'll get into, but I think my first kind of overall thought, just glad that it's done. Not really surprised at any of the particulars. As I said, I believe this makes him the second highest paid coach in all of college basketball. Only Bill Self is paid higher. But if you listen to the show, I've said from the beginning, being the highest paid coach in college basketball was not the priority for Dan Hurley. What was the priority since the beginning was to, yes, be in that highest tax bracket of college basketball, but also on top of that, and this was the important part, it was to set the program up to operate at the highest level. as we go into this world where the Big Ten and the SEC are going to have so much money, what Dan Hurley wanted behind the scenes wasn't to be the highest paid coach. It was the promise that he was going to be able to run a program that would operate at the highest levels with Kentucky, with the Big Ten schools, Indiana, Michigan State, Michigan, whatever. That Tom Izzo isn't going to have something that he can't get or have access to, that John Calipari at Arkansas, that Mark Pope at Kentucky, that whoever it is, that he has access to all the same things those guys have. So that was always the deal, but he is in the highest tax bracket. But listen, this is great news if you're a UConn fan. It locks him in for the foreseeable future. What I think is equally as important, his two lead assistants, Kamani Young and Luke Murray, both got 3-year contracts, according to reports. Tom Moore, longtime assistant, also got a 1-year extension as well. That, to me, is actually very important, and that may be low-key. I can't say, listen, it's clearly not more important than keeping Dan Hurley. That's for any school in college basketball, I think the number one priority this offseason is make sure Dan Hurley is happy, 2-time defending champion. But behind the scenes, the role that Kamani Young and Luke Murray play is huge. And bluntly, this now makes it really hard for them to really leave for anything other than like a really, really, really elite coaching job. It's funny, every offseason, I always hear, well, how do these guys not get head coaching opportunities? And it's like, well, Dan Hurley is brilliant because he's done like what so many other coaches have done. I think he's probably sacrificed a little of his own salary to make sure that his assistants are well taken care of. And so now you have two assistant coaches that my guess would be they're paid about as well as any assistants in college basketball. They're on 3-year contracts. And so ultimately, where are they going to go? My guess is they're both making high 6 figures, low 7 figures. And so you can't go to a central Connecticut, to a Western Michigan, to a place that's going to pay you, $300,000 a year. You're going to have to take a pay cut to become a head coach. And so those guys are in place. I think having a 3-year contract also probably means that realistically, those guys probably have some sort of buyout to get them out of their contract. So if you hire them, you're probably going to have to pay back UConn something as well to get them. And so you have those guys locked up. You have Dan Hurley locked up. And let me also say this. I think what's interesting is, back to Hurley, you look at his salary. I know the NBA is his dream. And I know the NBA probably at some point will be a place where Dan Hurley coaches. But this is going to make it pretty hard to pull him away. Because I think we think that all these professional teams, they just spend money like our favorite college team does. Kirby Smart's making $12, $13 a year. Dabo's making $11, $12 a year. Kalen DeBoer's making $8, $9 a year. Sark's making $10. Mike Norvell's making $9 or $10. Professional contracts, especially in the NBA, aren't really like that. For fun, I went and looked it up. You know that Dan Hurley, that $8 million salary, which puts him second in college basketball, would put him 6th in the NBA? There's only 5 coaches that make more than him. Now, the ones that do make a lot. Steve Kerr makes like 17 and change. Greg Popovich makes a ton. Ty Lue in the Clippers makes like 12, 13 million a year. But there are, 25, 26 NBA head coaches that are making less than Dan Hurley. So now, to get Dan Hurley, you're going to have to pay above market value for an NBA head coach just to get him interested from the money perspective, let alone from the basketball situation. Is it a place he would go? And so if you're a UConn fan, I think that's the low key, the most interesting part, is that this is now a contract that makes it that much harder for NBA teams to get him. Now, again, if somebody wants him bad enough, they can offer the $15, $20 million a year contract. They can offer to double his salary. But all of a sudden, you're talking about putting him in a pay grade that is, there aren't very many NBA teams quite like that. And so when I think about UConn, listen, we did our UConn, our off-season grade with UConn a few days ago. And I bring it up because with UConn, I think we are seeing the best of UConn, and I don't think it's slowing down anytime soon. Now, I know nobody stays on top forever, but you look at where Dan Hurley has this program, and we talked about it in the off-season grades piece. I think this thing's only going to continue to go up. Now, listen, you can't sit here and say that he's going to have a team next year or in 2 years or in 5 years better than this 2024 championship squad, because that team was historically great, at least by UConn standards, 37-3, one loss all season when they had their full roster of players. But at the same time, you start looking at how recruiting's going right now. The fact that basically UConn is now at the point where they're not really recruiting as much as hand selecting players. Liam McNeely, we talked about it a few days ago. When he committed the first time out of high school, committed to Indiana over Kansas, UConn wasn't really in the mix. Decommits from Indiana a few months later, all of a sudden UConn gets him. It speaks to how quickly the brand grew and how this is now a school that can get pretty much anybody they want if they seriously pursue them. Malik Thomas, 5-star, saw over the weekend. Rivals.com said they would be stunned if anyone other than UConn landed him. 5-star guard. Some of the other recruits in the class of 2025, Nate Ament, the big kid from Virginia, the big kid from New Orleans. It seems like all these kids, if UConn goes after them, they're in the mix. And so I don't want to sit here and say it's going to be better than back-to-back national championships in a historically great season. But when I look at where UConn is, I think this is only the beginning. I think this staff is probably together a minimum of another year to 2 at minimum and maybe longer. I think this contract makes it that much harder to get Dan Hurley to leave even for an NBA job. I think it already has officially eliminated any other college job. He wouldn't even take a phone call from Kentucky. If he's not taking a phone call from Kentucky, he's not going anywhere in college. But now, I don't think he's going anywhere. And I think if you're a UConn fan, you should be really, really, really excited because it is a great time to be a Husky. I just don't think this thing is slowing down anytime soon. I don't think it's slowing down anytime soon. Doesn't mean they're going to win the national championship. Doesn't mean that even next year I'd probably have Alabama and Kansas ahead of them. But doesn't change the fact UConn is here to stay. Really quickly, let's wrap the show with a couple other news and notes. Let me say this. Can I just say, I know that we don't talk a ton of NBA on this show. 2, beyond that, I would also add that on top of that, I know we don't talk a ton of NBA, but I will say this. Seeing Team USA basketball get together in Vegas this past weekend to start prepping for the Olympics, I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty freaking fired up because it's really cool. Like we were talking about on Fox Sports Radio over the weekend. It's kind of this last hurrah for this older generation of guys. LeBron is on the team. Steph Curry is playing in his first Olympics. Kevin Durant is on the team. But then you have the new guys like Anthony Edwards, Jason Tatum that are kind of that next generation of guys. Then you also have this weird group of guys that are still sort of on the back end of their prime, but haven't really played Olympic basketball before. Joel Embiid, the first time he's ever representing the United States in international competition. Kawhi Leonard has never played in an Olympics. I'm just going to say I'm really excited about watching this team. By the way, I saw this from Anthony Edwards. Anthony Edwards cracks me up, man. He was asked about kind of the hierarchy of the team. Is it LeBron's team? Is it KD's team? Is it Steph's team? Here's what Anthony Edwards said. He said, quote, "I'm still the number one option. Y'all might look at it differently, but I don't." Can I just say, I love this kid. I was dead wrong about him, by the way. Remember, before the 2020 NBA draft, I was like, this kid out of Georgia, they didn't win. He was good, but how good is he? Did that interview where he said, I prefer football over basketball any day of the week. I was like, I don't know how good this kid's going to be. Now he is the face of the NBA, at least from the American perspective going forward. He's going to be on this Olympic team. I'm just really excited. There's nothing really else to add. There's no real take to be had. But LeBron, Steph, and I know LeBron's gone through all the stuff with Bronny this weekend. But I would just sit here and say, like, I'm actually genuinely excited to watch this Team USA basketball in the Olympics. By the way, no Bronny talk on today's show. Only sports talk show in America that will not be talking Bronny. I promise you that. We don't need to talk nepotism. We don't need to talk whatever. As you know, it was a crazy weekend. Had his first Summer League game, 4 points, whatever. I just don't really care. All right, I'll tell you what. Think it's time for me to get out of here. Appreciate everybody's support on a Monday coming out of the holiday week. No, it is a little bit of a quiet time in the world of college sports. So if you're not subscribed to the show, please make sure to do so, because here is the deal. We aren't slowing down. anytime soon in this college sports, college football, college basketball conversation. As we said, we'll continue to ramp up the college football coverage as we get closer to the season. And if there's news and notes from college basketball, from recruiting, from whatever, we will make sure to continue those conversations as well. So make sure you're subscribed. If you're not subscribed, make sure to do so. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, wherever you listen to podcasts, make sure to subscribe. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. Go ahead, give us a quick 5 stars. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, all that good stuff. Make sure you're following on social media at Aaron_Torres on Twitter, at Aaron Torres Pod on Instagram, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. All for today's show. Do think it is officially time for me to get out of here. Shout out to Torrin Craig. Shout out to Rachel, who hates my voice. Shout out to JJ Redick, Los Angeles Lakers head coach.